Ovid is in some ways the most important poet of Roman antiquity. Virgil sort of gives him a close run for his money, in the sense that he exercised an enormous influence on the Middle Ages, through the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, and then right into modern times. His best-known poem probably is the Metamorphoses, the poem from which the little extract on Daedalus Nicarus is taken, which is such an original poem, it's such an inventive poem that it's really hard to say what kind of poem it is. So it's, I suppose, a kind of epic. It's a little bit like, for example, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid, in the sense that it's a very long poem in several books. It's about mythology, so Ovid manages to bring in just about every mythological story from Greek and Roman myth and combine them into one poem. But just for that reason, it's nothing like Homer or Virgil in that it doesn't tell one complete story. It packs all these different stories together in an incredibly inventive way. So one of the most wonderful things about the Metamorphoses is the way that Ovid manages to link the different stories together very, very cleverly, all sorts of different ways of joining one story to another. A kind of textbook almost for the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, because his Metamorphoses has such a kind of aspiration to completeness. I mean, it's a terribly hubristic poem. Epic generally tends to have high aspirations, but the Metamorphoses has a kind of aspiration to be absolutely global, to bring everything in, whether briefly or at length. And for that reason, you can use it as a kind of reference work. You know, if you want to tell the story of Apollo and Daphne, where do you go? You go to Ovid. If you want to tell the story of Daedalus and Icarus, where do you go? You go to Ovid. And I think you can see very clearly in a lot of Renaissance paintings in particular that they had Ovid's version specifically in mind. So with Daedalus and Icarus, everybody thinks of the famous Bruegel painting where you see the ploughman in the front, the ploughman is in the foreground, Icarus is sort of falling into the sea in the background. And that precisely picks up that moment in Ovid where he says that somebody ploughing the fields looks up and sees this strange sight, the winged man dropping from the sky. But there are a lot of examples of that where you can see that the Renaissance painters were looking specifically to Ovid. And of course it works with literature as well. Shakespeare, for example, is absolutely stuffed with Ovid. Other contemporary writers too. Yeah, I think so. Ted Hughes, for example, wrote versions of many of the stories from Ovid's poetry, and he's far from being alone there. There has been a lot of interest in, again, particularly in the Metamorphoses, but also in the exile poetry. Poems he wrote towards the end of his life. He was exiled to the Black Sea region, and this was a terrible disaster for Ovid. He hated being away from Rome, which was the centre of the universe as far as he was concerned. But the sense of displacement, I think, that we can see in those exile poems already comes in some ways in his earlier poetry. You can almost see the exile poetry as a logical conclusion of this idea of being a little bit off-centre that you find in the earlier poetry as well. And that's something that's quite appealing, I think, to a modern sensibility. We want to pick out what it is about Ovid that appeals to us now. But also, I suppose, the self-consciousness that, as I say, he's always very aware of his own cleverness, his own originality. He begins his love poems, for example, instead of saying, I fell in love with Corinna, he begins by saying, I was trying to write an epic, and along came Cupid and shot an arrow into me, so I couldn't write epic anymore. I had to write love poetry instead. But hey, I had no one to be in love with. I had to find a girl. So the poetry comes first. And again, that sort of very self-conscious way of thinking about literary creation is something that really strikes a chord again, I think, with late 20th, early 21st century writers, and this kind of postmodern phase, or whatever it is that we're in now. That's a very interesting question, actually, whether Ovid ever has anything serious to say. And depending who you read, you'll get quite different answers from scholars. My view is that what he's really serious about is art in a broad sense. So the self-consciousness is part of it. But I think artfulness is, in all sorts of ways, is also very interesting to Ovid. So in some ways, this is perhaps most clearly apparent in his wonderful poem. It's a sort of mock handbook on the art of love, in which he purports to teach his reader, his pupil, how to find a girlfriend, how to seduce a girl, and how to hang on to her. And then in the third book, he turns around and addresses girls instead and tells them how to find and keep a male lover. But one can argue what that poem is really about is turning this uncontrollable passion, the kind of passion that earlier love poets wrote about, into something that has rules that you can do in a really controlled way. And that might sound quite unappealing to a modern audience. I mean, we don't like to think of being too much in control, maybe. But I think that is something that Ovid himself was very serious about, that, or, you can read him as being very serious about, that living in a civilized way. And so that's partly about writing really refined poetry, but it's also about celebrating things like the fact that we live in an age of luxury. So instead of saying, oh, well, we're terribly decadent, we have too much money, we have more luxuries than is good for us, Ovid turns that around and says, hey, I'm really glad I live in this modern age where we don't walk around dressed in skins, we don't walk around dressed in rough homespun. We have sort of the ancient equivalent of Christian Dior and Prada and all the rest of it. He would love magazines like Vogue, for example, I have the sense, where it's all about stylishness and really celebrating stylishness, both in literature, but I think in other aspects of life as well.